We're back, and we're here with Kim Stanley Robinson, whose latest book is 50 Degrees Below. Welcome back.
Thank you, Tom.
Got you back a little earlier than we did the last time, not as much of a gap.
Yeah, well, it's good to be back. I'm trying to do these books as fast as I can, actually.
Well, before we start talking about things, to set this in perspective, when did you finish the book?
I guess probably February of '05.
February of '05.
Yeah.
So this is before the flooding of New Orleans.
Right.
This is before the tornadoes in the Midwest in November.
Mm-hmm.
This is before we had 11 inches of rain here in the Washington, D.C. area in about a 1-week period to stop a 3-month drought.
Right.
And we're just about ready to plunge into serious winter temperatures tomorrow when we finally get down into the 30s and 40s as our highs.
Yeah, from 70s today.
From 70s
yes.
today. 70s today. So the time machine is home and you have it parked out in the back.
Well, these have been pretty easy things to call. I mean, the writing's on the wall. The planet is already heated up by a significant degree, measurable, and we've had the last decade's been the hottest decade ever recorded. And we all, I mean, I think everybody's already aware of all this. So it's a relatively straightforward thing these are not hard calls to make, that the weather will get crazy.
Let's talk about the story. This is interesting. Now, at the end of 40 Signs of Rain, Washington was a floodplain as far as the mall was concerned. All the reclaimed land went back to nature.
Yes.
Water was lapping at the foot of Lincoln and well up on the Washington Monument.
Yes.
And as we come into here, the water has subsided and some remediation is occurring. But there doesn't seem to be a wholehearted effort to put everything back to exactly the way it was before the event, which has some rather frightening similarities to what's going on now in New Orleans.
Yes, I hope it doesn't turn out that way down in New Orleans, but it occurred to me that Washington, D.C. is not universally popular, you might say even universally disliked, or at least the extremes of our American political spectrum, that both ends have reasons to dislike the capital that are different reasons, but it adds up to the same kind of dislike. So that I was thinking that although the things that people said, the official line would be, oh, of course we have to restore the nation's capital, that this would probably be one of these underfunded mandates, let us say, and that the job would only get partially done, so that the billboard stuff, the mall and the monuments would get repaired.
The tourist stuff.
Exactly, as a matter of national policy and tourist policy, but that behind the scenes the city might be left limping a little bit, and that this would be characteristic, that the world itself is going to have trouble with infrastructure repair if too many catastrophic events happen at once.
As we're experiencing now with the tsunami in Southeast Asia and our problems here on the Gulf Coast and the coast of Florida. And now there seems to be a level of donor fatigue creeping in and affecting the relief efforts in Pakistan, in Kashmir.
Yeah, the big earthquake in Kashmir and not as much help being sent there. And I think we have to conceptualize a world in which there are going to be frequent extreme weather events, and of course earthquakes are a different matter, and tsunamis, but in terms of weather disasters, they're just going to become more common, and that it can't really rely on individual charity, because everybody's already kind of close to redlining in their own personal budgets. So that it has to be infrastructural, that the structure of society itself and the reinsurance companies, especially as the ones at the end of the stick, are all going to have to be helped out, and that it's going to have to be a total social response, and that takes it into the realm of science fiction.
As I was reading the book, I kept thinking to myself, if I turned 2 or 3 pages at a time and just wrote down a couple of topics, because you touch on so much in this thing. I mean, I could spend the next week Googling and not be able to really get into all the things you touch upon as you walk through the story that you're telling. There's a tremendous amount of information, tremendous amount of intellectual conceptualization scattered all throughout the book. Where's the chest drawer that you have that you pull this stuff out of?
Well, I too can Google, but I mean, this really is what novels should do. Novels are about everything, and they are about the way we live now, as Trollope called one of his novels. And so, and they are the places where you organize the stories that tell what it all means, so that novels are about life's meaning ultimately. And that right now draws in so much, and it draws in the world of science for sure, but then also what it means for individual existence, so that it remains focused on characters, which is another crucial aspect of novels. But these characters, as living in the world that we live in right now, which is like a giant science fiction novel already, you do have to be aware of so many different things at once. And there are problems with this in terms of organizing principles. I mean, if the novel should be about everything, how do you manage to make it about something and keep a plot line going? And then I think my solution has always been find characters who are interested in things and have responsibility for things, and then follow their train of thinking and what happens to them, and that way you've got the string that you can put all these beads on.
And your focal point in this book is Frank van der Wal.
Yes.
Who was a principal character, but not as dominant in 40 Signs of Rain as he is in 50 Degrees Below.
That's true.
He really is the prism through which you view most of these events.
Yeah, that's right. This is one of those cases, and to tell you the truth, I'd never quite believed this in the past before, of a character kind of taking over. And what I think it comes down to is that what he's involved in is what I want to talk about. And so he just became, and he's also got the most interesting personal problems. The other characters from 40 Signs of Rain, I mean, some of them were loosely based on people that I know, even myself, and there are limits to the amount that I want to put those fictional characters through. And as a novelist, of course, you don't want to have limits like that. But with Frank, I don't have those limits. I can talk about everything in Frank's life, and I can also have anything that happens to him I'm willing to follow along with. So he becomes some sort of the type of the scientist. What should the scientist do in our time, given the extreme environmental damage that is coming down? What's the responsibility of the individual scientist? And so Frank is a kind of a stand-in for that whole class of society, and as such, you know, I wanted to follow him, and he kind of took over.
Well, and it's interesting. One of the things that you discuss in the book is, and it's through Frank, is kind of trying to think about how did we get to where we are, and part of what the novel discusses are the various other climactic extremes that our species had to experience and how that affected our development into where we are now intellectually and physiologically, and how extremes in climate can force behavioral patterns to come into play that basically assure survival and then continue on as an element in our cultural and possibly in our physiological and biological makeup as predictors of success.
Right. Yeah, I mean, environmental stress has shaped the human body and mind. The repeated ice ages and various kinds of change to the climate have been ongoing. And so even though we have created this one, the fact of the environmental change itself is not unusual for our species. And indeed, humanity, in the archaeological record, you can see that in some ice ages we actually extended our range rather than contracted back. So extreme weather is not an unusual thing for humans to have to face, and indeed has shaped us. And Frank is a character who is perhaps trying to rely too much on sociobiology and our evolutionary past to guide him in his individual day-to-day behavior. I mean, it's a very powerful system of explanation for why we behave the way we do, but you need more than sociobiology to become a coherent modern human.
And he is integrating more in. I mean, he started out that way in the first book, and then he met the monks from Kamalung.
Yeah.
And had an epiphany. And now he's been, you know, although that's still a part of the mix of his observational matrix, more things are coming in all the time.
Right.
As he first loses his apartment and ends up in a treehouse in the middle of a ruined Rock Creek Park.
Yeah.
And then still maintains his role as a scientist at the National Science Foundation, as an acquaintance of various friends and characters we meet through the book, like the Quibblers, and also has an increasing level of interaction with the monks who are still in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm very interested in this notion of the relationship between Buddhism and science that is slowly becoming more obvious. And the Dalai Lama is one of the people on earth that's making it more obvious because he's so intensely interested in science and is a sort of leading intellectual figure in the world today. But for me, what it does is it brings in a sort of ethical or moral aspect to the sciences. So, and it's something I've been saying for a long time, that the sciences are not value neutral, that science already is a kind of proto-politics or a kind of utopian effort to make human interactions be more just, reasonable, and even compassionate, that a lot of science has been designed in order to reduce human suffering. So that being the case, there's relationships between the two, and there's things that science could learn in terms of what should we do with science from the Buddhist tradition. So they are an element in this mix and a big influence on Frank. So I always tried to keep it two-track here in the way that almost all novels try to do, but very explicitly on the individual level, Frank's trying to figure out how should I live? And he's making his life a kind of experiment in a new way of living that consumes less resources and actually leaves him happier and healthier because he's trying to live like a Paleolithic. And he's a little bit of an extremist in all of his actions. He takes his ideas, he runs a little too far with them so that there's a certain comedy involved. But nevertheless, I think what he's trying is valid, and I'm interested in these things myself on a more sort of suburban and normalized level. I do think that it's interesting to consider that the way that we live as Americans now is actually bad for our health and our happiness.
There was a passage in the book where you discuss his experience as he's out there in Rock Creek Park, and then he walks back into he walks back up to the street, up to Connecticut Avenue.
Yeah.
And he's all of a sudden he's walked into a fairyland of bright lights and warm rooms and fancy restaurants and everything else like that. And he feels he has a grounding because of his experience in the park. And he sees it as a fairyland, while basically everybody else around him is essentially continuously living in a fairyland and has no anchor to the reality that is the real reality, so that they can have perspective to make their choices.
Yeah, so you have to think of ourselves as living in a cocoon of technology, or that we live in clothing that's made out of oil, in effect. Right now, the way our kind of first stage, somewhat brutal, you might even call kind of Stalinist technology in terms of its effects on the earth, needs to be replaced by a much more sophisticated and subtle and sustainable technology. So, but that doesn't just mean that you make ever more complicated and expensive machinery. Technology includes education and the sort of software which is our thinking. And so Frank is trying to imagine that in the Paleolithic period, our brains expanded by a factor of 3, even though we were doing the same thing over and over. And this is really interesting to both him and to me. How could it be that pursuing exactly the same activities without any changes for many, many hundreds of thousands of years, the brain blew up like a balloon? Those activities must be the ones that we enjoy and that are the best for us. So he starts to think about, I only need to do what Paleolithics did, and I will be healthier and happier. And of course, he uses far less resources.
But he's also going to an extreme.
Well, definitely, yes. He's single, or so you might say divorced, and he doesn't have any kids. So he's only responsible for himself, and most of us are not that way.
Most of us are part of a social construct.
Yeah, and a family, and we end up being responsible to more people, and he is sort of free to be an extremist. And not only that, but he runs into a whole crowd of homeless people in Rock Creek Park, and they are not so much...
Who are basically kind of a human analog to the feral animals that escaped from the zoo in Novel 1 and that are still occupying Rock Creek Park, not all of them having been captured and returned to the zoo.
Yeah, that's right. There's ferals of all kinds that are beginning to appear, and that's already beginning in American society. A lot of young people are looking at the system and saying, well, I can either be mortgaged to this system for my entire life, or I can try to carve out something of my own with my own little community. So there are ferals and freegans that are already out there on the urban boundaries of America. So I just pushed that a little bit further in the usual science fiction way.
Now we're going to talk about one more thing because we're going to be running out of time soon, and that's the National Science Foundation, which is a key element in the storytelling here.
Yes.
And you have just come today from reading some of your work to a bunch of people at the National Science Foundation. What was their response?
Well, they laughed. I mean, the thing is that everybody wants their story told in novels, but if you work at NSF or you work in any federal bureaucracy, there's not a whole lot of fiction that is about your life. And it's famously true that the novel is supposed to be bad at writing about people's work, but I still think that people would like to see novels that incorporate more of their reality. So they're very pleased at this. I mean, NSF, hero of a novel, no matter how much they laugh at that concept, they still want to read that book. And if you read the NSF passages at NSF, there's a certain kind of mirror-facing mirror quality that is pretty fun.
And we should let people know that this, despite the things that are happening here, there are some pretty frightening things that are coming down the pike. The altering of the currents in the ocean as a result of the infusion of fresh water from the melting of the caps, and a number of other things, the increase in the carbon in the air.
Yes.
And the other things. This is essentially optimistic because it says there are remediations out there if we have the will to focus on them.
You have to think that, okay, global warming is real. It's been established. It is happening. We can't stop it outright. So there's going to be some global warming. But what's recently become obvious is that it might introduce abrupt climate change. So that it isn't a matter of the world being 2 degrees warmer some 200 or 300 years in the future. Not anymore. It could tip over into a completely different climate regime, which ironically or paradoxically might be even colder in the winters, in Europe especially, and in the eastern half of North America. Now, since these things are real possibilities, I thought it would be an interesting thing to write about them as if they were really happening, because they are really happening. So in other words, the science fiction scenario has become reality, and if you want to write science fiction now, you sort of have to write a kind of realism about what we're doing right now. So it is true, though, that there are some things that can be mitigated, that if we acted quickly to change over our power generation system and our modes of transport, and essentially not stop burning so much carbon, that we could make it much less of a disastrous situation than would otherwise happen. So I'm thinking that with abrupt climate change, a real possibility with such drastic ramifications of that we get into a zone where we have to treat it like a kind of a Manhattan Project or a kind of a World War II against a different kind of enemy, much more amorphous and sort of tucked into the structure of the way that we ourselves live. So that we are the enemy, but we also are the side that's not a bad thing. If you are the enemy, it means that you can change the way you live and actually sort of make some victories without having to kill anybody.
And that could be the next good war.
Yeah,
a war worth fighting for everyone.
Well, exactly. And it isn't like we have to think of it really as a war basis. It could be just kind of a dance metaphor or some other metaphor that's a little more peaceful. Change of life, expanding of consciousness, or an improvement of our relationship to nature. You could almost use marriage metaphors. So the metaphor system needs to be chosen as being the most positive kind of a thing, so that you don't end up saying, oh yeah, we have to wage war on ourselves.
Right. Maybe the next good struggle, or the next big step.
Yeah, the next best project, or the new technology.
Well, and on that note, we will have to end this because we've run out of time. Stan, thank you very much for coming to visit us again. We really do appreciate it.
Great pleasure, Tom.
And we look forward with great anticipation to the third book.
Yes. Well, I hope we can talk about that again when the time comes. It should be spring of '07 that it is brought out.
We'll save some time in the schedule.
Okay. Well, I'm still working on it now, so I can't swear to that, but I think I'll be on time.
And with that, thank you again.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, that's it from this edition of Fast Forward. We hope you found something of interest, and we hope you'll come see us again. Until that time, this is Tom Schad saying, take care.